criador da escola do saber sobre o poder. Que o mundo moderno não mate os nossos sonhos, questiona sempre, inclusive os freirianos de ciência. O humanismo, dentro e fora da sala de aula, o aprender emana reflexão da complexidade humana. Paulo cristão, a base do pensamento racional. Ensino é um ato político cultural. Paulo Freire é educação, pensar transforma, muda, é abolição. Freiriana é sua missão, pensar transforma, muda, é evolução. O conhecimento liberta, vamos transformar, educar o mundo de dentro pra fora, interpretar. Mundo líquido, monolítico. A solução é alfabetizar, é reinventar. Me dê a mão e vamos para a luta já. Braços abertos, a felicidade encontrar. De braços dados vamos ao outro ajudar. Paulo, pernambucano, franzino, valente, homem de bem, revolucionário, pensador, além do seu tempo, destemido como um futuro visionário. Você sim merece uma estátua, meu rapaz. Herói nacional, defensor da cultura e paz. Foi traído, perseguido. Seus ideais foram oprimidos e subjugados. Portanto, amor ao próximo, Paulo foi exilado. Plantou a semente com amor e dedicação, com métodos da primária à pós-graduação. Paulo, ser humano garrido, professor mentor dos mais oprimidos, alunos com valores, ético crítico, criador da escola do saber sobre o poder. Que o mundo moderno não mate os nossos sonhos, questiona sempre, inclusive os freirianos de ciência. O humanismo, dentro e fora da sala de aula, o aprender emana reflexão da complexidade humana. Paulo cristão, a base do pensamento racional. Ensino é um ato político cultural. educação. Pensar transforma, muda, é abolição. Freiriana é sua missão. Pensar transforma, muda, é evolução. O conhecimento liberta, vamos transformar. Educar o mundo de dentro pra fora, interpretar. Mundo líquido, monolítico. A solução é alfabetizar, é reinventar. Me dê a mão e vamos para a luta já. Braços abertos, a felicidade encontrar. De braços dados vamos ao outro ajudar. Paulo, pernambucano, franzino, valente, homem de bem, revolucionário, pensador além do seu tempo, destemido como um futuro visionário. Você sim merece uma estátua, meu rapaz. Herói nacional, defensor da cultura e paz. Foi traído, perseguido. Seus ideais foram oprimidos e subjugados. Portanto, o amor ao próximo Paulo foi exilado. Plantou a semente com amor e dedicação, com métodos da primária à pós-graduação. Paulo, ser humano garrido, professor mentor dos mais oprimidos, alunos com valores, ético crítico, criador da escola do saber sobre o poder. Que o mundo moderno não mate os nossos sonhos, questionar sempre, inclusive os freirianos, dor de ciência, humanismo, dentro e fora da sala de aula o aprender emana, reflexão da complexidade humana. Paulo cristão, a base do pensamento racional. Ensino é um ato político cultural. Paulo Freire é educação. Pensar transforma, muda, é abolição. Freiriana é sua missão. Pensar transforma, muda, é evolução. O conhecimento liberta, vamos transformar. Educar o mundo de dentro pra fora, interpretar. Mundo líquido, monolítico. A solução é alfabetizar, é reinventar. Me dê a mão e vamos para a luta já. Braços abertos, a felicidade encontrar. De braços dados vamos ao outro ajudar. Paulo, pernambucano, franzino, valente homem de bem, revolucionário, pensador além do seu tempo, destemido como um futuro visionário. Você sim merece uma estátua, meu rapaz, herói nacional, defensor da cultura e paz. Foi traído, perseguido, seus ideais foram oprimidos e subjugados. Por tanto amor ao próximo, Paulo foi exilado. Plantou a semente com amor e dedicação, com métodos da primária à pós-graduação. Paulo, ser humano garrido, professor mentor dos mais oprimidos, alunos com valores, ético crítico, criador da escola do saber sobre o poder. Que o mundo moderno não mate os nossos sonhos, questiona sempre, inclusive os freirianos de ciência, humanismo, dentro e fora da sala de aula o aprender emana, reflexão da complexidade humana. Paulo cristão, a base do pensamento racional. Ensino é um ato político-cultural. Paulo Freire é educação, pensar transforma, muda, é abolição. Freiriana é sua missão, pensar transforma, muda, é evolução. O conhecimento liberta, vamos transformar, educar o mundo de dentro pra fora, interpretar. Mundo líquido, monolítico, a solução é alfabetizar, é reinventar. Me dê a mão e vamos para a luta já, braços abertos, a felicidade encontrar. De braços dados vamos ao outro ajudar. Paulo, pernambucano franzino, valente homem de bem, revolucionário, pensador além do seu tempo, destemido como um futuro visionário. Você sim merece uma estátua, meu rapaz, herói nacional, defensor da cultura e paz. Foi traído, perseguido, seus ideais foram oprimidos e subjugados. Por tanto amor ao próximo, Paulo foi exilado. Plantou a semente com amor e dedicação, com métodos da primária à pós-graduação. mais oprimidos, alunos com valores ético-crítico, criador da escola do saber sobre o poder. Que o mundo moderno não mate os nossos sonhos, questiona sempre, inclusive os freirianos de ciência, o humanismo, dentro e fora da sala de aula, o aprender emana, reflexão da complexidade humana, Paulo cristão à base do pensamento racional, ensino é uma...
Hey all, I am honored to have the chance to welcome you to Hot House's centennial celebration of the work of Paulo Freire. My name is Adam Bush, and I'm the provost and co-founder of College Unbound, a radical higher education infrastructure and accredited college built in conversation with the legacies of Freire, of Miles Horton, of Septima Clark, and others that we'll talk about tonight. I'm so thankful to Margaret Hoiberg and the Hot House for bringing us together. The Hot House, to me, has been such an important organizing spot. This was one of my first introductions to Chicago and to Chicago's musical tradition some 20 years ago. Now, this year-long multidisciplinary series of documentary and feature films, music, symposium, and other public programming celebrates the legacy of philosopher and teacher Paulo Freire. This program tonight is presented, as you saw, with support from Illinois Humanities, Oppenheimer, and others, but also certainly through donated labor and resources by so many others. We gather tonight virtually, but with each of us situated in and on land with legacies of violence, of theft, of forgetting, embedded within them, within those steps. These spaces on which we reside, the land we are all on and are part of, is a part of who we are and how we know the world. So in talking today, as we will, about popular education, about radical imagination, we too have to surface questions that are so embedded into both the why and the work of learning together. We acknowledge silences as we ask, whose knowledge gets to be named and valued? Whose gets remembered? And with that too, whose knowledge gets erased? These questions are ever present in our news cycles and newspapers, certainly, just as they are embedded in place and in history. So let this not just be a symbolic recognition, but a call to action and to solidarity. So we gather tonight with organizers and educators alike in exploring enfranchisement, literacy, and popular education movements of and with citizens in the US South. Through the films that we'll show and discussions that we'll have, we'll look at the connections between popular campaigns to advance literacy and situate that with the fight against white supremacy in an internationalist context and the ongoing work towards emancipatory democracy in the current moment, all before 9:30 p.m., I hope. In tonight's run of show, I'm going to briefly get a chance to introduce my co-conspirators, who you'll be able to see on the screen in a minute, and we're then going to screen 3 short films and return together to talk. In introductions, I'll start, of course, with Dr. Fannie Rushing, a professor of history and global studies at Benedictine University. Dr. Rushing publishes articles, organizes symposium, lectures on the African diaspora in Latin America and the civil rights movement in the United States For the last 10 years, Dr. Rushing's also been the co-chair of the Chicago SNCC History Project. She spent her life investing in and uplifting Black and Brown communities, and we're so thankful to be in this space together with her. I'd also like to welcome Bill Ayers here, a distinguished and sometimes retired professor of education at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and active teacher all over the place always. Bill's the founder of both the Small Schools Workshop and the Center for Youth and Society. He's Zooming today with us from Colby College in Maine, where he's teaching their winter session. And Bill's written extensively about social justice, democracy, education, and cultural contexts, and teaching is an essential intellectual and ethical enterprise. I'm also thrilled to welcome Ashley Woodard Henderson here. Ashley is a longtime activist, the first Black woman to serve as the co-executive director of the Highlander Research and Education Center in Newmarket, Tennessee. As a member of multiple leadership teams in the movement for Black Lives, Ashley's thrown down her vision of Black Lives and for the Breathe Act. Ashley served on the Governance Council of the Southern Movement Assembly, the Advisory Committee of the National Bailout Collective, and is an active leader on the front line. I'd also like to call into space Reverend Allyn Maxfield-Steele, who also serves as the co-executive director of Highlander Research and Education Center since 2017. Allyn's movement work focused on connecting people and grassroots communities to one another through high school and college education, through faith and spiritual leadership, and organizing on a range of front lines throughout the United States South and through Appalachia. He's committed to figuring out how people and organizations transform together, through, and with, and how rural folks can together teach everyone to build powerful movements. So, I mean, we could just talk and we could go through 9:30, of course. As you can see, we have this amazing group I'm excited to be in such deep conversation with. Before we even jump into the films, I'm wondering if I could turn to my panel, and perhaps in the order that I just went through to introduce folks, if I could ask each of you to give us a preview of sorts of something or someone we should be on the lookout for in the films that we're about to screen as a group. And then we'll return to some of those themes as we come back together. So Dr. Rushing, I wonder if I could turn to you for a moment. Is there anything we should be on the lookout for? Set the stage.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. I think what I would hope that people would see and take away is the historical context for the development of movements in the 60s and the 70s. You frequently hear that the civil rights movement began in the 1960s. And when we look at Highlander, one of the things we see is the base that movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s could build on. And in order to do that building, someone had to recognize the importance of making connections, not working in isolation, connecting the dots, something we don't do in the United States very well. And so Highlander became that place where the dots could get connected and people could come together. The other thing that I think is so important is the extraordinary bravery of the people at Highlander, the extraordinary people in the South, people like Herbert Lee, people like Vernon Dahmer. We don't know those names, but we should, because long before organizations such as the student groups of the 60s and the 70s, these people were working on, they were demanding the fundamental American right to vote. And they were doing so by paying an extraordinarily high cost. Not only were these people murdered, none of these people were murdered without being tortured for days often before they were actually killed. And so what I hope we will, as we watch these films, as a way of kind of paying homage to that tradition of organizing, that tradition of struggle that goes back in the United States to 1783 with John and Paul Cuffey, and in other parts of the Americas, even before that, with the slave rebellions and slave revolts throughout the Americas. So looking for that tradition of struggle and paying homage to that.
Thank you, Dr. Rushing. Bill, you want to just jump in next?
Yeah, two quick things, Adam. One is to underline something that Dr. Rushing ended with, and that is to look at the bravery and the courage. You know, of all the virtues that people have, without courage, those virtues kind of wither and die. But the extraordinary courage of these teachers and these organizers is worth looking for. Second thing is, I think that people should be on the lookout at this particular historical moment at the ways in which aspects of the Freedom School curriculum, aspect of the popular education practice lend themselves to movement building, to movement making, to revolutionary action. And I think that's what we should be uncovering, particularly at this particular moment.
Thanks, Bill. Ashley, you okay to jump in next?
Sure. I mean, one, I just agree with what my comrades have said so far. What I would add is just some things to question, like what is a right? What is a right? What does it mean to be a citizen, and what rights should citizens have? And should they have it and others not, right? Just some basic questions to consider. Who gets to decide who counts and who doesn't? Questions about governance and governments, I think will come up as you watch these. I would also just say, what's the consequence of every American having the right to vote? What happens when more people vote, right? Is a question that I think should come up for us as we watch these films. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't say, in closing, a couple of things. One, think about like how intergenerational the folks in this that you're going to see in these films are, right? That they might be talking to you in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, but they were doing this work in their 20s and 30s with folks who were in their 50s and 60s in the 60s, right? Think about how intergenerational it was then and could be now. Think about the importance of place, right? The role of the South in the fight for voting rights then and now, the fight for racial justice then and now. And then the central role of popular education. We're all teachers and learners in the fight for voting rights. And then lastly, I think what you're probably going to get pulled to think about a lot as you watch these films is the centrality of the fight for Black liberation and an end to anti-Black racism. But what I think there's an opportunity to dive a little deeper into as you watch these films is the central role of Black women who were doing some of this work at the intersection of gender and race in the fight for, the right to self-determination and governance. So those are a couple of the things that I would add.
Thanks, Ashley. Allyn, you want to jump in next?
Yeah, I really resonated with what Dr. Rushing shared around who are the folks who are not named, who are influencing those who are named. Where do they show up? How are they spoken about? What are the contexts that they're coming from? So those are big questions that come up for me. And the second one is, in each of the stories, what is the particular illiteracy that the educators and the people are saying is fundamental to address in order to build power? And what might that conjure for us now in terms of what is there such a thing as a fundamental illiteracy that we need to address in our own communities, in our own lives, to build power? What would that be? What would those be possibly?
Thanks, Allyn, Dr. Rushing, Bill, and Ashley. I mean, a lot of tonight and these films are also pushing against what is school when we use that word. Where does learning happen? I, of course, came to this unprepared, though, with a computer, but no notes. And so I was like scribbling furiously on my hand that I will try and like not smudge over the next hour in the presence of really these deep thoughts and provoking questions. I want to bring one other thing to this space because it's Hot House that's bringing us together, and Hot House specifically as a place for music bringing us together. I want to also bring the legacy of Zilphia Johnson Horton, and Highlander's first director of cultural programs, who spurred the mobilization of folk culture and really music, especially in the service of social justice causes, helped create the songbook of the labor movement, the soundtrack for a lot of the popular education that we're going to be talking about today and learning about. And so in these documentaries that we'll be stepping into in a minute, we'll also, I encourage you to listen to the music that's there, to think about both the directorial choices that were made, but also the music that's in the background and the cultural work that is so key and critical to this teaching and learning. Of course, Miles Horton and Paulo Freire's "We Make the Road by Walking" is a critical text that was in a study guide for tonight, and that makes sense for us to return and come back to and think about. Also, there's one part where Miles writes, "What I finally decided after 3 or 4 years of reading and studying and trying to figure this thing out was that the one way to do something was to start doing it and to learn from it. You don't have to know it in advance, because if you know it in advance, you kill it by clamping it down on the people that you're dealing with it. So let's start doing, let's start the films, let's start learning from it and with one another, and we'll come back together. I want to pass it off for the streaming of 2 shorts by Catherine Murphy. They say I'm your teacher in Freedom Schools, and we'll come back to discuss a little bit in about 15 minutes. Thanks all.
I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and segregation was a way of life. We didn't question it, we accepted that. But then I went away to New York to find employment, and when I returned in 1947, I became aware, fully aware then, of how segregated Charleston really was. The only way we felt we could bring about changes was through the vote. And blacks weren't allowed to vote in the primaries in South Carolina and in Charleston. And the primaries really was the regular election because we didn't have but a one-party state. Once the decision was handed down that everybody could vote in the primaries, there was another block that was placed in our way. We had to read a section of the South Carolina State Constitution in order to be able to vote. Some people could read and could pass the test, but there were many, many that couldn't. I knew there were people who couldn't read and write. I've been knowing that all my life, but I never felt there was anything anybody could do about it.
In 1952, a woman from here went to Washington, D.C. to a conference, childhood education conference. And when she came back, she said that there was a place in Tennessee where blacks and whites could work together on problems. And down here, we couldn't even speak to each other. So I thought that was a wonderful place to go.
I came to Holland in 1955 because my cousin, Septima Clark, had been there the year before, and she told me about blacks and whites being at Highlander, working together at the Highlander workshops. And so I was curious to go and see for myself what she was talking about. It was the only place in the South where blacks and whites could really meet so that we could know that we had allies out there. The beautiful part about Holland is that you could be washing dishes with somebody who had, like Dr. King used to say, had a PhD or no D's. Whatever was on your mind, you could say it. The whole workshop was a demonstration of how you'd get people to talking about what they think is the most important thing they need to have done in their community. Esau Jenkins from Johns Island, who came up with us to the workshop, was there. What I'd like to have out there is a school to teach my people how to read and write so they could register and vote, because that's our basic problem, you know. And that turned the whole workshop around. People from the North want to know why we couldn't register to vote. So then we started talking about Charleston, Johns Island. Esau ran for the school board. He really ran to try to win because they needed representation on the school board. But he also ran in order to show the people that if they were registered to vote, that they could win. The groundwork was set then to getting citizenship classes going. Many of the people on the island worked long hours in the field, so the classes could only be held during those months which they call the laying-by season, which is December, January, and February. Miles Horton of Highlander said to Esau, "You find the place, and I'll look for funding for the classes." They asked me to teach the class. I said, "No, I'll help anybody who is going to teach the class, but I'm not going to teach it." Well, when they said either you do it or we won't have a class, then of course I couldn't turn it down. First thing I said to them was, they say I'm a teacher, I'm your teacher, but I'm not a teacher. And we are going to learn together. You're going to teach me some things and I'm going to teach you some things. And I think that one statement sort of put everybody at ease. Anna Vashteen, I will never forget Anna Vashteen. She couldn't read or write. And it was the greatest reward when I had all the names up on the board one night. And I asked them, could they pick their names out? Miss Vashti said, I see my name. And she went down the list and she took the ruler for me and she said, that's Anna. That's my first name. And then she went over on the other side, up and down, until she found Vashti. And she said, that's my name, V-A-S-T-I-N-E, Vashti. And goose pimples just came out all over me because that woman couldn't read or write when she came in and she was 65 years old. Any community we went in and operated citizenship classes, if there was no particular community organization in that area, we would organize that first class into an organization so that they would have some ongoing influence in the community and an ongoing learning process. They'd say, well, we don't have a leader in our community. And we said, well, what about you being a leader? Well, no, I'm not a leader, they would say. But we say, you know the problem. If you know the problem, you see the problem, you know what needs to be done to solve that problem, then you're the one that have to take the ball and run with it. It's like light coming into darkness. Once they learned how to read and write, they always voted after that. We started with a pilot project at the Citizenship School, and the results were such that everybody wanted it. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew, and it grew. And it was really the basis of the entire civil rights movement. The entire civil rights movement built on that base because people became aware of the power that was within them that they could use to get things done.
You got to move, you got to move, you got to move, child, you got to move. But when they're long, get ready, you got to move.
The first freedom school that I was connected with was not even called, for the most part, a freedom school. There were students from the Macomb area. A notice was given to the parent of all of the different students that had walked out that in order for their children to come back to school, they had to sign a statement saying their children would no longer at any point in time participate in civil rights activities. And there were many of the parents that refused to sign that statement. So here we were, those that were a year or two older, with all of these young people now not having a school to go to. And until we can work this problem out, we're gonna start our own school to keep the students up on their academics, as well as introducing some new subjects, voter registration, political education, and all of that, which should make it a better school. As we continue to work in the civil rights movement, Charlie Cobb came with the notion that we should have freedom schools as one of our major things that we deal with during Freedom Summer.
We were in the midst of planning for this summer project, or Freedom Summer, if you will, of 1964. I proposed the Freedom Schools, and that was an organizer's response. The question was, if you're going to have roughly 1,000 students from the north, essentially, coming down here to Mississippi, what are you going to do with them? One potential of having all of these students coming from some of the finest colleges and universities in the country, we could use their learning.
A lot of people were not able to read or write, and that was due to early on they had not been given the money that's been passed down from the Freedmen's Bureau to the different counties for black people to be able to go to school. People like James Foreman, who was a school teacher himself and organizer, he came in with the whole concept of literacy, as well as Bob Moses, who had been a school teacher in New York and attended Harvard and was teaching in school when he came to Mississippi. Education was emphasized in my home by my parents. They didn't have a very high formal education, but a great deal of emphasis was placed on that literacy because so much had been taken, land and all kinds of other things were taken away from you because of your inability to be able to read and write.
The way the system worked, ever since really the days of slavery, was to keep black people, as I said, illiterate or non-functional, and work to teach black people to believe in their own inferiority. That's the way the system worked. And the white people felt the only education black people needed was enough education to pick cotton or tobacco or sugar cane.
Many of the black children that had to work in the cotton fields, they wouldn't start school until very late, and then they would be taken out of school early in order to, harvest and to plant.
I was about 11, 12 years old. 1964, of course, that was 10 years after the Brown decision, and Hattiesburg still maintained two school systems. We had wonderful black teachers who were dedicated and committed to our education. They did a wonderful job. But yet, segregation was responsible for us not getting the equipment and the resources to which we were entitled. We routinely received second-hand textbooks, or sometimes third-hand textbooks.
The whites were handing us down their books year after year, and they would get the new books.
You know, they talk about the segregated schools, but our teachers were as well qualified, as well trained as the white teachers. And in the classroom, the teachers sacrificed a lot because they would buy books for us because they weren't getting money for the library books. And they would take from their little salaries and put money into the school.
This is a public school paid by taxes from the public, and my parents were paying taxes just like white parents were paying taxes.
And so we definitely wanted to help children sort of close the gap between what they were learning in the public schools. This school was an arm of a movement that was trying to bring about deep societal changes. And so this also was reflected in the curriculum, as well as exposing them to a much wider world than they had experienced.
Okay, we're back. In the meantime, I've transcribed most of what I wrote on my hand into, I think, what a guide for a pretty good time together. Once again, just to remind folks, I'm joined here by Fannie Rushing, by Bill Ayers, Ashley Henderson, Allyn, Maxfield-Steele, really mentors of mine, leaders nationally and internationally, and amazing educators, thinkers, and organizers I'm so excited to be in conversation with. And these films really set the stage for, I think, what we can grapple with, some of both the themes, the questions that they put out there, and histories that maybe we want to make sure our audience understands, has a chance to really talk and think through. Allyn, I wonder if I can go to you first. Talk a little bit more about the legacy and work of Septima Clark and how that then affected the legacy and work of Highlander, which you now sit as co-executive director of. And then Ashley, if you want to join in after that, okay?
Sure, happy to, Adam. Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, it's helpful to start by talking about Highlander a little bit, because Highlander started in 1932. It was founded by at least 4 folks. Miles Horton gets a lot of credit for it, because Miles was brilliant and very capable organizer and educator and wizard of all kinds in that way. And he was also the longest serving founder. There was James Dombrowski, Don West, and a lot fewer people know about Elizabeth Hawes, who is one of the first folks who helped start Highlander. And then Highlander also started on land and in a place that was given to Highlander's founders by Dr. Lillian Johnson, who's one of the first women to receive a PhD in the US South. She was the president of a college that would eventually be the staging ground for a lot of the freedom rides in Ohio. But then she retired in the Cumberland Plateau in Eastern Tennessee between Chattanooga and Nashville. And she was doing all this rad agricultural, cooperative, educational experimentation work. This woman named Mae Justice was doing this rad children's education work down the street. And the two of them were friends. And then when these young kids came up and said, we want to start a school to establish a new social order, they were like, yeah, we have a building and we were thinking about bequeathing this to somebody who would be doing something similar. So we'll give y'all a try. And then 2 years later, Lillian gave the land to the Highlander Folk School, which is what we used to be called before the state of Tennessee stole that name from us in 1961. And so what Highlander was doing between the 30s and the 50s was a lot of the work of the time was around how do we solve some of the problems that were coming up around the era known as the Great Depression. The South experienced some of those impacts the worst and first. And so Highlander's staff was thinking seriously about how do we use education to mobilize and work alongside and inside and as part of the organizing project to transform the social, economic, and cultural order of the South in particular, but also the world, because the founders were connected to all of these international movements that were hot and heavy in the South already and throughout the rest of the United States. And so there was a lot of work focused on labor, unemployed workers, and Highlander became known eventually within its first 10 years or so as a place where Black and white workers could come together. Because even though all the staff at the time who founded Highlander were white people, they started recognizing that none of this work that we were going to be doing along economic and unemployment work or labor organizing was going to happen if we were going to do it in segregated ways. So there was some real cutting edge work around that in the 40s. And then over time, Highlander recognized that the biggest movement that was coming up was the work that folks like Esau Jenkins and Septima Clark and Bernice Robinson were getting down with in the low country of South Carolina. One of the ways that we like to describe the origin of the citizenship school program that Septima really spearheaded and brought to Highlander was that Esau Jenkins, who had a 6th grade education, or 6th grade formal education is a better way to put it, was at a meeting where everybody was getting into this conversation around the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm paraphrasing what Esau said, but he said, how do you expect us to even really get into this UN Declaration of Human Rights if our folks don't even know how to read it? And that pivoted the way that the whole workshop was going. And so there was a lot of investigation and exploration of what it would look like to start doing some literacy work. And that really came from the folks in the Sea Islands, particularly on Johns Island, and particularly in a home base known as the Progressive Club, which was a shop up front and then a school in the back when the citizenship school really started there. So Septima was a teacher. She had gotten fired for her work with the NAACP. Her relative, Bernice Robinson, was a hairdresser. She was one of the first educators within the citizenship school program, and they brought that program to Highlander, and Highlander helped to find resources for it and help to catalyze its existence, right, and help to spread it out in the mid 50s. But I'll kick it over to Ash to carry the rest of the story.
Sure. I mean, I think you told the story. I think what I would add is just a couple of things. One is that Miss Clark is the world's greatest teacher. Like, let me say it unequivocally. There would be no Highlander Center and there would be no first Black woman executive director had it not been for her interventions, many of which Miles gets credit for, but really was work that Septima Clark did as staff at Highlander. And then she didn't just participate in programs. She didn't just staff the Freedom Schools or citizenship schools, it was known at the time. At Highlander, she went on to serve on our board of directors with the likes of Rosa Parks and others. So very literally, she not only created programs, she stewarded and drove the organization to sustainability. And now 90 years later, we're still talking about her incredible work, the work that she did to teach and train, create educational containers for hundreds of thousands of Black people in the South before the internet, before cell phones, right? There's so much to learn about how to build these containers from Miss Clark and Esau Jenkins and Miss Robinson's literally lived experiences, right? That you have to be in a place to know the conditions, right? That you have to have relationships with the people to know the conditions to build the containers, right? That you had to be in a place, and that went on to influence so many others, right? How SNCC developed their programs, et cetera. So I think that's important. The second thing that I would say is important is, like, she was also low ego, high impact, right? Allyn talked a little bit about the state stealing our name and land, et cetera. That didn't happen just because they're greedy. It happened because they recognized that the infrastructure that we were building in the Black liberation movement, right? This catalytic effort that Miss Clark was spearheading was actually dangerous to the status quo, to the people, mostly white men, who were consolidating their wealth and power by any means necessary, right? And so they attacked our infrastructure. What did Miss Clark do? Miss Clark and Miles worked together to say, hey, Dorothy Cotton over at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, maybe y'all should take this really quick while we move to Knoxville to not start a new organization, but actually just change the name so that we can continue this work while the state does all this attacking, right? So instead of being like, this is mine, these are my resources, this is my program, I started it, it is only me that can do this. Ms. Clark worked with other Black women to say, hey, listen, it's not about me, this is about this work continuing, right? And move the resources, move the program to a whole nother organization that got a lot of credit for, again, a thing that she and Miss Bernice and Esau Jenkins helped to start, right? So I think it's incredibly important. The last thing that I'll say feels critical to understanding sort of Highlander's motive around some of our educational interventions, both then and now, y'all. We're not a living museum. We're actively continuing the legacy of folks, including some of the folks that you've seen, like Hollis Watkins, who is on our board of directors, and others, is that, you know, this was happening at a time where it was literally illegal for Black and white people to be hanging out with each other. Right. It was a forbidden conversation, forbidden because the powers that be said it shouldn't happen. And literally only for the sake of them being able to continue to consolidate their wealth and power at the expense of the Black people and working class white folks that were coming together at Highlander at the time. I mentioned the segregation piece, not because, you know, the ending segregation was the only thing that the Black liberation movement of the 50s and 60s was doing. I actually know that not to be true, but because it was a time where physical distance from one another was being perpetuated because of a law. Right. And people were still figuring out how to practice social solidarity. Allyn often talks about it in the context of the Depression, right? Again, people didn't have a whole lot. People were being forcibly, you know, displaced from one another because of the economic crisis. And they were still figuring out ways to come together across difference to practice social solidarity. I think there's a lot we can learn about what it means not to just do education for education's sake, right? These folks weren't just teaching people to be literate for the sake of being smarter people. It was to move people to action so that they could build their own power themselves, right? It wasn't a freedom school just so they could replace, be an alternative to an existing system, though it might have consequentially been that. It was actually about building the power of Black people to self-determine and govern for themselves and participate in building democratic practices that they could sustain. And that's, you know, that's still the line of demarcation to me about whether or not you're running a freedom school or not.
Dr. Rushing, I wonder if you could speak next, talk about like some of those threads. When we did introductions, you went around and talked about connecting the dots and about intergenerational learning. I was wondering if you could bring that context into some of the history that Allyn and Ashley were talking about.
Well, one of the things that Highlander did was to serve as a bridge, certainly for SNCC people. It is where Mrs. Hamer first was able to travel outside of the state of Mississippi and to begin to see Mississippi in a much wider perspective. And I think that's one of the things that we all learned as part of the movement in the 60s, was that there was this long line of history that people were building on. It wasn't as if, as it is often portrayed, people just dropped the hose in the cotton field and walked to the ballot box. This is something that people had been struggling for years, and finding these forums where they could make the kinds of connections that put this on a national. I mean, that's where we first figured out racism is not just a problem in the United States. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It may have been born here, but it's a worldwide phenomenon. And, you know, that allowed us to then to begin to make connections to the African liberation movement. That is where many of us, particularly in SNCC, after leaving SNCC, you know, where do you go now? What do you do? And many people became very involved in the African Liberation Support Movement. This year is the 50th anniversary of ALD Day. Whereas we're not talking a lot about it now, but certainly at that point, we were able to understand and not being able to vote in Mississippi and apartheid in South Africa and beyond. I know for many of us, those discussions at Highlander made it possible for us to understand the importance of conversation in organizing. Grace Lee Boggs once said, when she was asked, I think by Danny Glover, how it was that she came to the knowledge that she had in her 100 years. And one of the things she said was that she and her husband, the late Jimmy Boggs, always did was to make time for conversation. That conversation was a key component of organizing. And what we found in the 21st century is that there are fewer and fewer places for us to come together and have a conversation. Because, and certainly COVID has really destroyed that, but we don't understand how important it is to be able to come together and to share about strategy, to share about a future. And so Highlander certainly provided that by opening up conversations about, what are we talking about when we're talking about education? Are we talking about education for the status quo, or for Black and Brown and other oppressed people? Does education really have to be about liberation? If it's not about liberation, it's not really education. It's just training to replace the existing relationships of domination and subordination. One of my fears about popular education being co-opted into school systems is that, at a key moment, it will be so watered down that it really won't be about liberation. And there's no point in struggling for education if you aren't really going to liberate yourself and your people. So that's a fear I have, but I'm grateful for forums such as this, even if it has to be in this terrible format, that we can hear once again what it is that our allies are doing around the world. We talk about living in a globally interconnected world. We have to live in a globally interconnected world of struggle. We have to make sure that people are understanding that people are fighting for liberation all around the world. And how do we make those connections? One of the things that, and I think this is unquestionably true about ending apartheid in South Africa. Certainly there was struggle inside the country, but there was this tremendous, tremendous international struggle that forced the South African government to its heels. We certainly need a similar movement around Israel and Palestine today, but that is almost absent from the conversation. And yet here again, you cannot be opposed to apartheid in South Africa. You cannot be for freedom unless you work for the freedom of all people. And one of the things that bringing people together in common forums enables us to do is to understand the interconnectedness of our struggles, because all the effort is made to divide as opposed to bringing together. I'm not sure I answered your question. I may have wandered afield.
Dr. Rushing, I think you not only, you started about connecting the dots, you not only connected those dots, you added new ones and drew lines all over in this way that has painted a fuller and fuller picture. So thank you for that. Bill, I wonder if you could pick up some of those threads, because this thing about what does it mean to be so local and place-based? And not so, I don't mean to emphasize at the dismissal of other things. So what's the relationship between the local and the global interconnectedness that we need to further in that education and learning allows?
Well, I want to start with a couple of questions that I have for my comrades. Loving listening to this history, loving the dots being connected. I have a couple of questions. One, I have wondered for a long time, I've never gotten to ask you, Ashley, although between the three of you may know this. Here we have in the United States, a civil rights movement, a Black liberation movement with a new energy, a new generating energy in the 1950s and 60s. We have Highlander, and we have the development of popular education freedom schools in Mississippi and elsewhere. on the one hand. On the other hand, half a world away, Paulo Freire is developing popular education. Did they know each other? Did they ever talk then? I know they did eventually, but you know, to Fannie Rushing's point, you know, it's an international thing. Here's one branch of this very revolutionary pedagogy, revolutionary curricula, developing in the south of the United States and in rural Brazil. Was there a formal connection? Was there conversation?
Yeah, I love this question. And Allyn also, and Dr. Rushing, because I know y'all know the answer to this question too, feel free to hop in. I mean, one of my favorite, you know, pop ed nerd books is actually a book that Paulo and Miles talked together, right? We Make the Road by Walking. We have a Horton Chair fellowship at Highlander. Allyn has had it. Many other folks that you all know, like Alicia Garza and others, have had it. But Paulo was the first, and it was literally to some degree created to make the connection between Miles and Paulo, and from my understanding, help support the publishing of that conversation where they taught this book.
But what year was that, Ashley? That because
you remember, Allyn?
Yeah, that was the 80s. I mean, I think
exactly 87, I think.
Yeah,
but what I'm asking is about the
back
60s.
then.
I'm saying in the 60s. So Freire writes this book in 1964.
Right.
The freedom schools are popping up in 63, 64. Didn't they know about each other, or did they learn about each other later?
That I don't know.
I think it's a good question. You know, I wasn't even born yet. But you know, I imagine they did. Whether they had met yet or not, I cannot confirm or deny.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that Highlander's work was internationalist from the beginning. Right. In the most local context. And I think, you know, when you talk about like what connections might have been between US South and organizers in Brazil, it may not have been Miles, but it was probably other folks, right? It was probably other folks who probably passed through. I think that's a phenomenon that we experience a lot, is that people come to Highlander and then 20 years later, the friend that they had been there working their whole time came, it tells us the story about their friend who was here 20 years ago, and then that connection's made, and then all of a sudden we're working together and stuff. So I do think that I mean, but I don't really know, Bill.
I think that's true. I also think like the relationship between Highlander and the Danish folk school movement, and the Danish folk school movement and their relation to you know, Brazilian popular education practices. So it you know, again, one big happy family. But I don't know that they had actually interacted.
I see that, but what I find most interesting is that this phenomenon would grow out of a revolutionary moment that was global, and the revolutionary moment called for a revolutionary pedagogy, and so it developed locally. It of course had its arms out, but that's a question I think is worth exploring, because I think in some ways it grew out of the mud and toil of struggle, not spontaneously, but, you know, without formal connection. And I just wonder about that. But the second thing, I'm sorry.
For folks who are listening, and Ash and I spoke with her the other day, Dr. Rachel Harding has done some work about Brazilian and US South connections. So for folks who are interested in that question, you or anybody else, follow Dr. Rachel Harding immediately. She's a brilliant wizard and part of Movement Fam for a long time. Sorry, Bill.
That's right. I mean, and I think just to that point, I think what's real is that and I think Dr. Rushing speaks to this often, is like, we're not the first, last, or only to do anything, including the development of the citizenship schools, right? Like, or Paulo and Miles in relationship to Pop Ed. People have been doing, you know, cultural convenings where everyone was telling stories, everyone was teaching, everyone was learning, as long as our people have existed. But what's real is the development and the sharpening of a methodological intervention is what made, to your point, is like this incredibly special and revolutionary thing that was transformative, that now we can actually say, like, that you have to do this to be able to build the kind of social movements that we need to win.
I also think my other question to you all is I do think that authentic education rests on two pillars. One pillar is enlightenment and one pillar is liberation. And I think, Fannie Rushing, you spoke about this when you talked about Fannie Lou Hamer getting a wider perspective. Suddenly we see the world differently. A wider perspective allows us to open space where liberation becomes more possible. But I share your concern about co-optation, and it's one of the major tools in the oppressor's toolbox is co-optation. So I guess my question back to you is, how do we imagine a pedagogy, a curriculum, a practice of enlightenment and liberation to spread and grow in contact with a social movement on the ground, but recognizing the danger of being loved to death, which is to not be loved at all, but to be embraced and then crushed?
I don't want to wander. It's when you use that word enlightenment, and I just finished Charles Mills's The Racial Contract. Okay, the Enlightenment in the same way after Charles Mills. So, but I don't want to do that. We can do that some other time because we do have forums where we can talk to each other. But I want to go back to this moment of connections. And this is not a shameless plug for the Chicago SNCC History Project. But I do want to say this, that this summer, we were working on the project for a documentary that Catherine's getting ready to do on the SNCC History Project. And one of the things that came across were letters from Noel Day to Charlie Cobb about the Freedom Schools. And actually, it was something I had forgotten myself, but there it was there in front of me. And I couldn't help but think how important that connection was. I mean, that's how Charlie actually brought these ideas to SNCC. The other thing that I came across was an extraordinary letter from Reyes Terina, the head of the land grants movement in the Southwest. And he's writing to Kwame Ture and to then H. Rap Brown about forming an alliance with SNCC around these issues. And Rap in particular is responding to Teherina about understanding the importance of this struggle in the Southwest and connecting it to the work of SNCC, and saying that SNCC would essentially stand in solidarity with the land grants movement. Well, we all know Rap has unfortunately spent the last 40, 50 years, most of it in solitary confinement. And so, that's a history that is lost, but one that is so important. And it seems as though every time we start to make these connections, start to connect the dots, you run into something of the type of COINTELPRO, which is COINTELPRO is not the first time that the state has actively intervened to destroy movements. And now we have other non-state actors that operate to do the same thing, to destroy those alliances. But it shows you how important the alliances and the connections are, because the minute you start to make them, an attempt is then made and is often successful in destroying those alliances. And so you talk about what voices have been silenced, what voices don't we hear when we talk about the civil rights movement, for example. I've never seen any place before, except in our archive, any mention of SNCC and a connection with Reyes Terina and the land grants movement. And so we have to make sure that these voices are not silenced, because they can empower us today. They can lead us to an understanding that it really is possible to make the kind of change, to create the kind of world that we want to have. But if we let the voices of the people be silenced, that is an arrow in the side of struggle. So it is so important now that we recognize the work of Paulo Freire, that we recognize the SNCC Freedom Schools, we recognize the Panther schools, we recognize the Afrocentric schools for all of their political limitations. It shows us what happens when people take control of their own education, when education is not something that's being imposed on people from the top down, but where people are building education from the bottom up to serve their needs. So this is a crucial moment. We can't forget about Freire. We can't forget about freedom schools. We have to have that knowledge, that information constantly before people so that they understand we can do this. Because everything is mounting to show us that we can't. I couldn't help but listen to DeSantis last night, ranting and raving about something that doesn't even exist for the most part, and trying to prevent people from understanding the past. They want to silence this history. They don't care whether or not people are uncomfortable. They know, they understand that when people know that they have power, they can use it. I mean, that's what this whole voting rights nonsense is about. I just have to think about David Walker, the 19th century Black liberationist, who was amazed at how the United States get away with what he called the colonizing trick, the stealing of Native American land and the enslaving of Black people. And we are still operating with the colonizing trick. We are today taking the land of Native people. We are stealing the labor of Blacks and other non-white people. And if we do not preserve our past, if we do not use our past to empower ourselves, now the whole planet is doomed, because these people are not only the architects of racism, it is a racism that is destroying the human body and destroying the planet. So we have to do this. We have to do this. And we have these models. We know what we learned from Paulo Freire. We know what people learned in the freedom schools. We know that it can be done. That's why you have Black and brown elected officials in all of these major cities, because that's what the voting rights movement of the 1960s produced, and they understand that. So now they are trying to destroy the voting rights movement. Sorry, again. See, that's what happens when you ask people to talk.
Don't apologize. And
That's why we're gonna keep
Adam, if you
asking.
don't mind,
Yeah.
if Dr. Rushing won't do the shameless plug for Chicago SNCC History Project, I certainly will, because a tool is only as useful as your access to it. You can go on the website at chicagosnc.org to have access to the entire project.
No, that's right, Ashley. And certainly what Dr. Rushing was bringing up was a memory project that's happening about the erasure of memory, and the preserving and the archiving work that SNCC Chicago History Project's doing is certainly critical for this group to know about, but for us to keep telling everybody to know about, so it spreads in that way. I have my moderator or like timekeeper hat on, where we have one more film we got to get to, but I want to use that as the segue to come back together to really talk about this moment that we're in. Freire in We Make the Road by Walking also says, there's no creativity without ruptura, without a break from the old, without conflict in which you have to make a decision. I'd say there's no human existence without ruptura. So I'd like to have us, we're going to pause as a discussant for 15 minutes while the film plays, but to come back and talk about that rupture of this moment and the creativity to come and the urgency of that. Thank you all.
During the cotton season, this is all just like snow, just white right across. All of this is cotton fields. During the 60s, when we would drive through here, you would see all of this people, picking cotton during that period of time, or chopping cotton, or doing the work in the fields that you now see in the tractors and stuff like that. African American people cannot even find work doing that these days.
He can sit down beside me. He can watch me go up there and register the vote. And he can watch me take some type of public office in his state. And he can sit down as I rule over him just as he's ruled over me for years, you see.
Several of us were actually beaten, and I was arrested also in connection with taking people to the registrar's office. We were beaten by civilians, people who gathered around the office while we were waiting for the people to register.
We worked on the political dimension of the problem back in the 60s, and we were able to really open the door so that people could get registered to vote and now participate in the politics. And coming back now, we really are looking at education as a tool to try to provide people with an entree into the economic arrangements.
I'm looking back to the people who were once in the civil rights movement, trying to locate those people. And so what we're doing is we're passing through places, we're finding the people who we worked with before, So
Bob Moses and Dave Dennis forged their partnership in the civil rights struggle of Freedom Summer. Today, they have returned to Mississippi as directors of an organization they call the Algebra Project. Their mission: teach mathematics to the sons and daughters of the sharecroppers and workers who they helped register to vote 30 years ago. They believe that all children can learn the algebra that will open the doors to college and meaningful employment.
Can I get your attention, please? All right, if you disagree, raise your hand. She did not walk it right.
For African American kids, children at a very young age, when they get to 6th, 7th grade, the world and institutions tell them they can't make it. And that system, same system, told people that you couldn't be a part of this system back in the 60s. And it stopped them from registering to vote. And that was the gatekeeper for people becoming first-class citizens then. And now it's a little bit more sophisticated, and it's called math. It's called algebra. It's called education that blocks them and turns them around. And we're saying they have that same right now to be educated and to pass through this system, just as they did then.
To reach the children who have been shut out of the educational system required a new way of seeing and a new way of teaching. In Cambridge in 1982, Bob found his inspiration for the Algebra Project in the Boston Metro. By taking a train ride with his daughter Maisha and then describing that trip in numerical terms, he was able to teach her algebraic concepts in a way that she clearly understood. By defining his starting point as 0, traveling in one direction can be represented as positive numbers, while traveling the other way can be seen as negative numbers.
We want a story about the location of where he finished in relationship to the location of where he started. Okay, who's got a story? Okay.
He started.
Well, you're telling me a story about Andre, because you're saying Andre started at Louis Grocery, but I don't want a story about Andre because I got that story already. We're saying the students don't come to the mathematical table empty-handed. They come there with their life experiences. So the issue is, how can we find in those life experiences the mathematical concepts? And then you want them to get ownership over those mathematical concepts.
+4. His stopping point was -1. Okay, let's go back over here to the board, and I'm going to, or I tell you what, better yet, you come up and draw it on the board over here. Draw me your trip. I'm gonna give you a different color. Draw your trip. When I was first introduced to the algebra project, I was not happy at all. I was a very regimented teacher. I wanted the children to be in their seats with their feet straight in front of them and their hands to themselves, and don't talk unless spoken to.
Go. 1, 2, 3.
It was working with the children, seeing their reactions to what they are being taught and seeing them get so excited about math, where before they hated to come to math class. Math was hard. It was something that they didn't want to do. It was a big bad monster. Now math is fun and they can't wait to get to math class.
Algebra is about reading and figuring out the problem and discussion in groups. The old math, I really wasn't good at, but now I'm good at it. I'm making a 90. My average is 92. It's gonna be negatives being positive this way.
In other words, you made some guesses and he made some guesses, so how are you going to figure out who guessed right?
You put them together?
No, well,
see who will pick the most.
Well, write down whatever you think, how you figure it out.
What's happening with the interaction that Bob is having with the kids, they're really into the process of learning. That is, they are questioning. They're not accepting what other people say. You know, they are trying to work it out themselves, first as an individual, secondly as a group. You know, it's not so important right now in terms of coming up with the right answer. You see, because we can give anybody get the right answer. You know, pick up a book. Here's the question. Next line, here's the answer. All right, now memorize that. Okay, tests come around. It's a yes, no, whatever it's on there, you see. But no, we're talking about the process, critical thinking. Kids beginning to raise the question of why. You're seeing kids who, if they had to take a standardized test, all right, probably would not make a good score, and the system would say these kids could not learn, and they would be boxed off into another area. And what you see now, kids saying, I might still score low on a standardized test, but I'm showing the world is that I can learn, and I want to learn. You see.
Thanks, folks, for sticking around and joining with us. And we're a few days shy of Bob Moses' 6 months after his passing. So it was nice to be in that space with him and to see this work reflected. There's a lot of conversation about electoral politics and disenfranchisement, certainly today. Tonight's films help us root that history in movements of enfranchisement, of popular education, certainly not just about getting the vote, about the freedom and liberation that comes out of that active organizing work. We talked about literacy. So this film certainly goes around math. I want to turn for a second to Ash and Allyn, who've talked about centering language justice in Highlander's current work. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the incorporation of that in this present moment, and then we can use that to get into some other stuff.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think presently Highlander's benefiting from 20 plus years or so of work that, similarly to the citizenship school program, really came to Highlander out of the request of different frontline struggles of people who are quite literally just trying to talk to each other. But not just people out in the field, but people in organizations who are building power with one another and So Highlander had a multilingual capacity building program that was stewarded by a dear friend, Roberto Tijerina, many years ago. Highlander works language justice as a methodology into its forward-facing programming and the work that we do out in the field. And I think in more recent years, we've really started to interrogate our own practice around what do we mean by language justice when there's many forms of English being spoken in a particular space? When are we talking about language justice, or are we talking about accessibility, particularly when we have deaf and hard of hearing folks who are right in the front and center of movements, but often left out because those movements are so often dominated by speaking people and hearing people, or hearing people is a better way to put it. So I think when I think about, the algebra project, I think it's another way of knowing. I was thinking about the kind of oddly anticipating your question by thinking about how old algebra is. It's like really old. It's like thousands of years old. And so thinking about that, it's just one way of trying to make sense of things, and how it's by the power of the state and power of empire has been used as a way to keep people away from each other and keep people away from making meaning of things. And I think that's exactly what the empire wants people to do, is to not be able to find common meaning with each other. And sometimes that's as simple as having simultaneous interpretation in a space, to where it levels out the power differences between an English dominant space or even a Spanish dominant space or what have you, right? So I think there's methodological approaches to it, but there's also kind of a fluid boundary around what language justice can mean, right? I think and that's actually the most important part, I think, is that it's consistently redefining itself based on who's in the space and who's in the room and who's talking to each other or who's trying to speak with each other and communicate. And I think it's just a really powerful methodology that if folks aren't figuring out how to use it, we're not building lowercase d democracy as best we can. So,
Ashley, do you want to add?
Just to build on what Ellen said, I mean, I think there are many ways to do it. And I also don't want you to misinterpret what he means. It is not like there are many ways to do it. So just like checking a box by having an interpreter is language justice. That's not what he meant. Because quite frankly, you could do that and we could have an ASL interpreter here, but if we actually haven't done the relational building work to have the folks that need that level of access being provided, then we really are only performing the methodology very topically and not actually implementing it as a practice in our discipline, right? It's just in the same way that diversity, equity, inclusion is just sort of like a co-opted term, and in the same ways that Bill and Dr. Rushing have talked about a concern about the co-optation of popular education and freedom school curricula and the like, the same is true for language justice, right? I hear people talking about it. It's just like a box to check and a to-do list, and not like its methodological foundational intention. And what I'd also say about it is like, even that piece that is about access is a step. The point of language justice is about decolonization, right? It's about recognizing what white supremacy and capitalism have done to dismember us from our indigenous ways wherever home was for us, right? So it's not just about having a Spanish interpreter. It's also about recognizing that Spanish is a colonial language, and that like actually people had indigenous languages that they spoke before the colonizer was ever present. And what does it mean to be honest about that and not just center the colonizer's story that there's only one way of us for us to communicate with one another, right? Is actually the point. And so I think the reason that Highlander is traditionally been building these methodologies out and not just saying you need to know this one or this one, but you need to know both of them, is that like you actually don't get to pop ed in its fullest without language justice, right? You literally can't. If the point is that we're all teachers and we're all learners, then us being able to communicate with each other the way that we want to communicate, the way that we can literally physically communicate, is critical to our ability to hear, to learn, to actually be able to share and teach, right? So it's critical to our methodological understanding of how do you build movements that win and then can sustain those wins. Is actually not an either or pop ed or language justice. It's that you got to have both of those things.
Thanks you two for that. Bill, I wonder if I could pass off to you to either talk a little more on this or about that, continuing on the fear of co-optation? And we lost you.
Sorry. What I was
Gotcha.
thinking as Allyn and Ashley were talking is, you know, at the risk of being professorial, James Baldwin has the greatest essay called "If Black English Isn't a Language, Then What Is It?" And I think that's worth checking out, as well as June Jordan's piece, "Nothing Mean More to Me Than You, Willie Jordan." And those are both really important to me, texts about language and some of the themes that y'all are talking about. But the other thing that came to my mind, you know, I want to go back to something that Dr. Rushing said about the Enlightenment. I love Charles Mills's book, and you're absolutely right. If you name it The Enlightenment, I want to run out the door and jump off a bridge. But what really, the Algebra Project, the language projects, what people are trying to do is to say, you can understand the world, and there's a big, wide, great world to understand in order to change it. And part of understanding the world is developing your own agency. One of the things that I think is hugely important is that the ruling class, the powerful, they always grant to themselves a sense of agency, history, culture, and the rest of us are written off by our statistical profiles, you know. And so somehow teaching that says to people, you have good questions. When I look at Bob in the classroom, I see that he recognizes everyone coming into the room is a three-dimensional character with a history, a language, a culture, dreams, hopes that have to be taken into account. That is very exciting, because what he's teaching, whatever else he's teaching agency. He's teaching that you have the power to understand the world. You have the power, if you choose, and you link together arm in arm, heart to heart, to change the world. One last thing I was thinking of as you were talking, Ash, is, you know, one of the projects that I love, two projects really from the West Coast. One is called the Slang Dictionary. And this is a group of high school kids who decided to make a multiple choice test that they could all get all the answers right, and the grown-ups could get none of it right. And they developed a multiple choice test. What is an onion? A root that grows in the ground, or this or that, a bag of drugs. Well, no grown-up knew what it was, but they all knew what it was. And from there, they developed a whole sophisticated project about language, what it means, who holds the power. And I go back to the Stokely Carmichael moment when he was teaching at a Freedom School, and that great transcription of the conversation that he had in the Freedom School with people. What is language? How does it develop? Who knows? Who has the power? And recognizing that language has power. The other one that I point to is youth radio, where kids developed a project of asking their own questions, pursuing answers in the service of creating knowledge and building new relationships in which space is opened where political action could take place.
You talked about agency. It also, the word trust, I think, runs throughout this too. It's folks being able to be in control of the learning, who they want to learn with and how, but have the tools to be able to build and create the space and have the trust between one another to do so. I wonder about that intersection of trust, bravery, and courage that we've been sort of circling around. And also being aware that we have like 6-10 minutes, something like that. We're in this range of like people having one or two more times around to say. So with those sort of themes, I wonder if folks want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can kick us off. I'm curious what Dr. Rushing has to say about it. That's why I was pausing. But just to jump into it,
yeah,
I actually don't know that folks just immediately trusted and chose who they wanted to teach them, right? I don't know that was historically true. I think what's real, as my grandmama would say, is like trust is like to build it, you have to do what you said you were going to do over and over and over again. And I think that's important because going back to what Dr. Rushing said earlier, right, is like the Freedom Schools weren't successful overnight. It wasn't like SNCC descended on the endangered backwoods Mississippian, and then all of a sudden they could read and write and vote. That's not what happened. What happened is they went for years and worked and worked, and people died and were attacked, and they worked and worked and worked. And then they realized when those white kids came down nationally, something shifted, right? But it took time. And what's real is like getting people bought in to being in this transformative learning experience and teaching and educating experience actually required people to build those relationships, for those people to be in that place, right? Folks moved to Mississippi and slept in their cars until people trusted them to live in their houses, trusted them with their children, trusted them with their own educational development. So I just want to sort of demystify. It's not just that people are coming to Highlander because they trust us. That's not necessarily true. Or because we've built a container where they trust each other. In fact, sometimes we're building containers where they explicitly don't trust each other. That's the thing that made Highlander a little different, right? Is like, in what world were hillbillies from the mountains of East Tennessee and Black kids from the Delta, or Black elders from the Delta, gonna be in the same space and trust each other until they could experience that in a container like Highlander, right? In what world were factory workers from Levi Strauss that were white, who were being told that Mexicans were still in their jobs, gonna be in a trusting relationship with one another for an educational intervention with those very, Latinx workers who were also being told that the reason they weren't getting paid well is because they were expendable labor in comparison to these white people, right? So some of it is creating the container in which trust can be developed, and that actually expands the amount of educational intervention we can get. The last thing I'd say about it too is it was wild to see. But one, shout out to Dave Dennis, who gets very little credit for all of his incredible work with CORE and in relationship to the development of the Algebra Project, but also in regards to Bob, is like the thing about folks like Bob and Charlie Cobb and Hollis Watkins and Margaret Block and all of these incredible folks that are mentioned in these documentaries, particularly the full lengths, is that they don't give you easy answers. So to Bob's point about agency, right? It wasn't like sometimes we wanted agency, right? My favorite stories about Bob was young people, including myself, being like, we think we should do this, and him being like, why? And we're like, can you just, if you don't agree, can you just tell us what to do? And he's like, no, right? Charlie Cobb begging him to just be like, okay, so should we do Freedom Summer? He's like, what do you think, right? So this point isn't just about teaching people how to create their own agency in relationship to the state, right? It's about literally thinking about these educational containers as opportunity for practice live and in living color, right? That we can actually practice freedom. We can practice self-governance. We can practice liberation. They're using algebra as a tool, right? But what's real is they're actually encouraging these young people to practice self-determination, practice problem solving and critical thinking, practice what it is to do these things together, right? You hear Bob in that segment saying, y'all don't have the same answer. How are you going to decide who's right? That's not just about an algebra calculation. That's about figuring out how to govern together, right? It's about power, not empowerment, right? They're creating the containers in which people can practice these things in low and high stake ways, right? That's actually the intervention. And so I think to this crisis of co-optation, it's like, we need to constantly be checking ourselves. The question being, at the end of the day, did we help people be more self-determining or not? And if we didn't, then that is not freedom schooling, right? And if they're just smarter, but that smart isn't going into changing their material conditions themselves in ways that they can implement and sustain, then that is not freedom schooling, right? We need to hold the line around it, because if we don't, no one else will, right? It's on us.
Dr. Rushing, I think you were flagged at the start of that. If you want to.
Say that I think it's a good way to bring the program to a close, that people from the next generation are talking. Not only if we don't have that next generation talking, all of this is for naught. The other thing is the anniversary that we're celebrating of Ferrari's work should be a call to action. It shouldn't be just thinking about what was done. We are charged because we believe ourselves to be political. We believe ourselves, and I'm going to just say it unabashedly, radical. And if that is the case, we are not really radical unless we are willing to take up the challenge and create those kinds of spaces that we created before, where people can come together and struggle together. This whole question of popular education, it's not going to be done unless we do it. I think with the Obama administration, people began to believe that they had no more work to do, that they would be led by the Messiah into the promised land. We need to, at this moment, take charge of the education of our children, because if we don't, we are going to, as Stokely once said, see something we really don't want to see. We will see more and more young people joining the other side. So this should be a call to action for a national coming together around popular education and creating spaces for popular education to take place. And it doesn't have to be in the public schools. It can be wherever we designate it. It's in the community, if we can ever get back to the community. It's everywhere, but we have to be responsible for creating those spaces.
I think that warning, that
That's
call to
it for
action,
me.
that was a perfect way to have it be. Maybe that's it for all of us. You mentioned and called in the programming of the 100 years of Paulo Freire. I also don't want to miss the chance to recognize 90th year of Highlander. Allyn and Ashley, if you want to say anything about any programming or ways that that's being marked, then we can duck out.
Absolutely. And just to put it concisely, what we did last year was spend the year really reflecting on the last decade and 80 years worth of work going into our 90th year. And this year, we're really inviting all of our comrades, you all included, to join us in thinking about what the future story is. We're legacy building today. And not just being dependent on the legacy that our elders and ancestors developed. We have interventions, as Dr. Rushing said, to make right now, if we seek to actually live in a context of democracy here or abroad. So we're encouraging people to help us design the future story. Where will we be by the 100th anniversary of the Highlander Center? We've got some ideas. We want to hear your ideas about what y'all are doing on the front lines. And so we'll be inviting you to public programming about that. You'll see public facing program about the next 10 years of Highlander and the Southern Freedom Movement from every single aspect of our organization, from our finance team, the folks that do development and fundraising, the folks that cut the grass and do our buildings and grounds work, and our educational team, which you all are already familiar with. If you want more information about it, follow us on the social media handles, sign up for our newsletter, or check out our website. You can also just give us a call or hit us with an email. We're glad to tell you what's coming up.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Hot House, for bringing us together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Much love, y'all.
Yeah.
Paulo Freire é educação. Pensar transforma, muda, é abolição. Freiriana é sua missão. Pensar transforma, muda, é evolução. O conhecimento liberta, vamos transformar. Educar o mundo de dentro pra fora, interpretar. Mundo líquido, monolítico. A solução é alfabetizar, é reinventar. Me dê a mão e vamos para a luta já. Braços abertos, a felicidade encontrar. De braços dados vamos ao outro ajudar.